The rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof of Ethan's car. He sat inside, feeling the chill seeping through the windows, his breath fogging up the glass. The empty road stretched into darkness on both sides, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of lightning in the distance. His phone had died hours ago, and now, with no way to call for help, he was stranded in the middle of nowhere. He cursed under his breath, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and he knew he couldn't stay in the car forever. He'd been trying to escape the life he was running from, but now it seemed like the universe was determined to stop him in his tracks. Just as he was considering walking to the nearest town, he saw headlights approaching in the distance, cutting through the downpour. Ethan squinted through the misty windshield, unsure whether to feel hopeful or anxious. It was late, too late for anyone to be driving out here unless they had a reason. The vehicle slowed as it approached his broken-down car, coming to a stop beside him. Ethan's heart raced as the driver rolled down the window. Through the rain, he saw the face of an older man, his skin weathered, his hair silver, and his eyes sharp but kind. "You all right, son?" the man asked, his voice carrying a calmness that seemed out of place given the storm outside. Ethan hesitated. He had been taught to be wary of strangers, especially out on lonely roads in the dead of night. But what choice did he have? "My car broke down," Ethan replied, trying to sound confident but failing to hide the tremble in his voice. The old man nodded, glancing at the car before shifting his gaze back to Ethan. "It's a rough night to be stuck out here. I can give you a ride into town if you want." Ethan looked at the man's truck, an old but well-maintained pickup that seemed like it had seen its fair share of hard roads. His instincts told him to be cautious, but the alternative, spending the night stranded in the freezing rain, seemed worse. "Yeah. Thanks," Ethan muttered, grabbing his backpack and stepping out into the rain. The cold hit him like a slap, and he hurried to the truck, grateful for the warmth inside. As he settled into the passenger seat, the man glanced over at him again. "Name's Jack," he said simply, pulling the truck back onto the road. "Ethan," the teenager replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, as if he already knew. The silence between them grew thick as the rain continued to hammer down on the truck's roof. Ethan stared out the window, watching the road disappear behind them, the world outside blurred by the storm. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the steady thrum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. But there was something about Jack's presence, calm, measured, that kept Ethan from feeling completely uneasy. "You're pretty far out," Jack said after a few minutes, his voice cutting through the quiet. "What's a young guy like you doing on a road like this?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't ready to share the full truth with a stranger, but something about Jack's tone was comforting, like he wasn't prying, just trying to understand. I had to get away," Ethan finally said, keeping his explanation vague. Jack didn't push. He simply nodded, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "Everyone's got something they're running from." Ethan turned to look at Jack, surprised by the quiet depth in his voice. There was something about the way he said it that made it clear Jack wasn't just talking about Ethan. He was speaking from his own experience. "You too?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel for a brief moment, but his voice remained steady. "Once upon a time. Long time ago." The air in the truck felt heavier now, as if the past Jack was hinting at had suddenly entered the space between them. Ethan could sense there was a story there, something deep and painful, but he didn't dare ask. Not yet. For now, he was just grateful to be out of the rain. The road stretched on for miles, winding through the dark countryside. Jack's truck seemed small against the vast, empty landscape, but inside, the silence between him and Ethan grew thick with unspoken stories. Ethan kept glancing at Jack, trying to figure him out. The man didn't say much, but there was a quiet intensity about him, as if he had seen things that left a mark. Ethan wasn't sure if he should feel reassured or wary. Jack was kind, offering him help when no one else had, but there was a sense that this wasn't the whole story. The storm outside intensified, the rain pelting harder against the truck. Jack's grip on the wheel remained steady, his eyes focused on the road. For a while, it felt like the storm mirrored the tension building inside the truck. Quiet, heavy, waiting to be broken. "Where are you headed anyway?" Jack asked after a long pause, his voice casual but curious. Ethan shifted in his seat, unsure how much to reveal. "I don't know. Just away." Jack glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Away from what?" Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't wanted to think about it, let alone say it out loud. "My dad, things aren't good at home." Jack didn't press for details. He simply nodded, as if he understood more than Ethan had said. "It's tough when home doesn't feel safe." Ethan looked out the window, his mind swirling with memories he was trying to leave behind. His father's anger, the constant tension, the feeling of never being enough. He thought that running away would solve it, but now, sitting in this stranger's truck, he wasn't so sure. "You ever think about going back?" Jack asked quietly. Ethan tensed at the question. "I can't go back," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I won't." Jack didn't react to the outburst. Instead, he let the words hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. "I know how that feels. I ran, too, once. Thought it was the only way out." Ethan turned to him, curious now. "From what?" Jack's face hardened slightly, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper pain. "From the war," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "You were in the military?" Jack nodded, his gaze distant. "A long time ago. Vietnam. I've been carrying that weight ever since." There it was, the unspoken story. Jack's past was tied to something more than just the usual troubles of life. Ethan could see the shadows of it in the way Jack held himself, in the way he spoke about the things that haunted him. "I don't talk about it much," Jack continued, his voice low. "But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It follows you, no matter how far you run." Ethan's chest tightened at Jack's words. It wasn't just the war Jack was talking about. It was the weight of regret, of choices made that couldn't be undone. And it was the feeling that no matter where you went, the past was always right there with you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The truck rumbled on through the rain, the storm outside a constant reminder of the chaos that both Jack and Ethan seemed to be running from. But as Ethan stared out the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that this ride wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about confronting it. The road ahead seemed endless, swallowed by darkness and rain, but inside the truck the atmosphere felt even heavier. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what Jack had just revealed. He hadn't expected to hear anything like that from the quiet old man who'd given him a ride. Jack's mention of Vietnam had unlocked a new layer of tension between them, something Ethan wasn't quite sure how to handle. Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the road, but it was clear that he was deep in thought. Ethan could feel the weight of unspoken memories pressing down on both of them. For a moment, he almost wished he hadn't asked about Jack's past. "You don't have to talk about it," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. Jack glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I don't," he replied, "but sometimes keeping it all inside just makes it heavier." Ethan understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. He'd been carrying his own burden for as long as he could remember. The tension at home, the pressure to be someone he wasn't, the constant fear of setting off his father's temper. He had run away to escape all that. But now, sitting in Jack's truck, it didn't feel like running had solved anything. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of the rain pounding on the windshield. Ethan didn't know what to say. Jack had opened a door into his past, but it was a door Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice low and reflective. "You know, when I came back from the war, I thought I could leave it all behind. I tried to move on, but it's not that easy. You can't just forget the things you've seen, the choices you've made. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. There was a depth to Jack's words that unsettled him, not because of the war, but because they echoed something he had been feeling himself. He had thought that leaving home would free him from the pain and frustration that had built up over the years. But here he was, miles away from home, and the weight of it all still clung to him. "What kind of choices?" Ethan asked, hesitant but curious. Jack hesitated, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "The kind that change everything," he said softly. "The kind that stay with you, even when you don't want them to." Ethan didn't press further. He could see that whatever Jack was holding on to, it wasn't something that could be easily explained. He understood that because he felt the same way about his own life. It wasn't just one thing that had driven him away from home. It was a lifetime of small moments, choices, and regrets that had piled up until he couldn't carry them anymore. But now, he wasn't sure if running was the right choice. As if reading his thoughts, Jack glanced over at him again. "Running doesn't always solve things, you know," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just takes you farther from the people who could help you." Ethan swallowed hard, the truth in Jack's words hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. He had thought that leaving home would give him control over his life, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe Jack was right. Maybe running was just another way of avoiding the real problems. "Why'd you leave?" Jack asked, his voice gentle but probing. Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to spill everything to a stranger, but something about Jack's calm, steady presence made him feel like he could. Maybe it was because Jack seemed to understand what it was like to carry a burden that no one else could see. "My dad," Ethan said quietly. "He's hard to live with. He gets angry a lot, and it's like, no matter what I do, it's never enough." Jack nodded, his expression somber. "That's tough. Feeling like you can't measure up." Ethan stared out the window, his throat tightening. "Yeah, I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to get away." Jack was silent for a long moment, as if weighing Ethan's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with quiet empathy. "I get it, kid. I really do. Sometimes getting away feels like the only option. But it's not always the best one." Ethan turned to look at him, confusion and frustration building inside him. "Then what am I supposed to do? Go back and deal with it? Keep pretending like everything's fine?" Jack sighed, his eyes never leaving the road. "I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying you should just go back and act like nothing's wrong. But sometimes, running away doesn't fix the problem. It just makes it harder to face later." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell Jack that he didn't understand, that he had no idea what it was like living under constant pressure, always waiting for something to go wrong. But deep down, Ethan knew Jack was speaking from experience. "You think I should go back?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with emotion. Jack didn't answer right away. He seemed to be considering his words carefully. "I think you should think about what you're running from," he said slowly. "And why? You might find that the real problem isn't something you can leave behind." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind swirling with thoughts and doubts. He had thought that running away would give him the freedom he needed, but now it felt like Jack's words were unraveling everything he had believed. The truck rumbled along the road, the rain still pouring down outside. The darkness pressed in on all sides, making the world outside seem distant and unreal. Inside the truck, though, the tension between Ethan and Jack felt very real, heavy and unresolved. For the first time since he'd left home, Ethan began to wonder if he had made the right choice. As the storm raged on outside, the conversation between Ethan and Jack quieted. Ethan was lost in thought, his mind racing with the things Jack had said. He wasn't ready to admit it, but something about Jack's words was starting to make sense. Maybe running away hadn't been the answer. Maybe he had been trying to escape something he couldn't outrun. Jack drove in silence, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but Ethan could tell he was thinking too. The air in the truck felt thick with unspoken thoughts, but neither of them seemed ready to break the silence just yet. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jack cleared his throat. "You said your dad gets angry a lot. You ever talk to him about it?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, right. He doesn't listen. He's always too busy yelling to hear anything I have to say." Jack nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "I had a father like that, too. Hard to talk to, hard to please. Spent my whole life trying to get his approval." Ethan glanced at him, surprised. Jack had never mentioned anything about his family before. "What happened?" Jack was quiet for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "I stopped trying, and by the time I realized I should have said something, it was too late." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy for Jack, but at the same time, he couldn't help feeling frustrated. How was he supposed to fix things with his dad when his dad was the problem? "It's not that easy," Ethan muttered. "My dad's never going to change." Jack sighed, his expression sad but understanding. "Maybe not, but the only way you'll know for sure is if you try." Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't ready to accept that just yet, but the seed had been planted. As they continued driving through the storm, Ethan found himself wondering, what if Jack was right? What if there was a way to face the problem instead of running from it? But for now, he wasn't sure he had the courage to find out. The truck rolled on through the storm, the windshield wipers moving rhythmically as the rain continued its relentless assault. Jack drove with a quiet focus, and Ethan sat in the passenger seat, lost in thought. The conversation they had just shared gnawed at him, stirring emotions he had tried to bury since leaving home. His father's anger, the constant tension, it was all still too fresh. But the way Jack had spoken about his own regrets made Ethan wonder if going back was even a possibility. They had been driving for hours when Jack slowed down, squinting through the rain. Up ahead, barely visible in the downpour, was a dimly lit gas station. A small, worn-down place with flickering neon lights and an old, rusted pump. It seemed out of place, as though time had forgotten it. "We'll stop here for a bit," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. Ethan looked at the gas station, then at Jack, confused. "Why? We still have gas." Jack didn't answer right away. He pulled into the gas station parking lot and parked under the dull, flickering lights. "Sometimes it's not about the gas, it's about taking a break and figuring out where you're headed." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan knew Jack wasn't just talking about the road ahead. He felt uneasy, unsure of what Jack had in mind, but the older man's calm demeanor kept him from asking too many questions. Jack turned off the engine and sat back in his seat, the storm raging around them. The gas station looked deserted. No cars, no signs of life, just the dim light from inside the small building. "I used to come to places like this when I needed to think," Jack said, breaking the silence. "Back when I was your age, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. Sometimes you need a quiet place to stop and look at everything from the outside." Ethan leaned back, unsure of how to respond. He had been running for so long, both physically and emotionally, that stopping felt strange, uncomfortable even. But maybe Jack was right. Maybe stopping for a moment was exactly what he needed. Jack unbuckled his seatbelt and nodded toward the small convenience store attached to the gas station. "Come on, let's grab a cup of coffee." The bell above the door jingled as Ethan and Jack stepped inside the small, run-down diner attached to the gas station. The place was empty except for an older woman behind the counter who looked like she had been working there for decades. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. Jack nodded to the woman as they took a seat at one of the booths near the window. "Coffee, please," he said. The woman nodded, moving slowly as she grabbed a pot and poured 2 cups. "Storm's bad tonight," she muttered, setting the cups down in front of them. Her voice was flat, tired, as if she had seen one too many nights like this. Ethan stared out the window, watching the rain continue to pour. The conversation with Jack still weighed on him, but he wasn't sure he was ready to talk more about it. He wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup, the heat grounding him for a moment. Jack took a sip of his coffee, his gaze far away. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I didn't always think about things the way I do now." Ethan looked at him, curious. "What do you mean?" Jack set his cup down, his eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the diner. "I used to be just like you, angry, frustrated, thinking the world was against me. My dad and we never saw eye to eye. I left home as soon as I could, thinking that would fix everything, but all it did was make the distance between us grow. By the time I came back, it was too late." Ethan listened quietly, sensing that this was the most Jack had shared about his past. The way Jack spoke, calm, measured, but laced with regret, made Ethan wonder if the old man had been carrying this burden for years. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Jack sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "He died before I could make things right. I never got the chance to talk to him, to tell him how I felt. And I've been carrying that with me ever since." Ethan's chest tightened at Jack's words. He couldn't imagine what it would feel like to lose that chance, to be stuck with that kind of guilt. For a moment, he thought about his own father, about the anger and resentment that had driven him away. Was he making the same mistake Jack had made? "You're lucky, you know," Jack continued, his voice quiet but firm. "You still have time. It's not too late for you to fix things." Ethan looked down at his coffee, his mind racing. Jack's words hit harder than he expected. He had been so focused on getting away, on escaping the life he hated, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he might be leaving behind. Was it really too late for him and his dad? "I don't know if I can fix it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's always so angry." Jack nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes people get angry because they don't know how else to deal with what they're feeling. That doesn't make it right, but it helps to understand where it's coming from." Ethan swallowed hard. He had never thought about it that way before. His dad had always seemed like this immovable force, someone who was impossible to please. But what if there was more to it? What if his dad's anger wasn't just about him? "I left because I thought it was the only way to get away from him," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "But now, I don't know." Jack leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You're at a crossroads, Ethan. You can keep running or you can turn back and face it. Only you can decide which path to take." The diner grew quiet again, the sound of the storm outside the only noise. Ethan stared at the rain, feeling the weight of Jack's words settle over him. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to go back, but something deep inside him was shifting. Maybe running wasn't the answer after all. They left the diner after finishing their coffee, the storm still raging outside. The rain had let up slightly, but the road ahead was still slick with water. Jack started the truck, and the warmth of the engine filled the cab as they pulled back onto the highway. For the first time since leaving home, Ethan felt like he had a choice to make. Jack had laid it out for him clearly. He could keep running, or he could go back and try to fix things. It was a terrifying thought, but at the same time, it was the first time Ethan had felt like he had control over his future. "Where to?" Jack asked, his voice calm but expectant. Ethan hesitated. The idea of going home filled him with dread, but the thought of living with the same regrets Jack had was even worse. He didn't want to carry that weight for the rest of his life. Maybe it wasn't too late. "Take me home," Ethan said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "I need to face it." Jack nodded, a small, satisfied smile on his face. "Good choice, kid." They drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out before them like a blank slate. The storm was beginning to pass, and the first hints of dawn were starting to break through the clouds. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. As they neared Ethan's hometown, the streets became familiar. The houses, the sidewalks, the trees, All the things Ethan had grown up with but had wanted so desperately to leave behind seemed different now. He wasn't sure if it was because of Jack's words or because he had changed during the long, stormy night, but something inside him felt lighter. The truck pulled up outside Ethan's house, the porch light still on. Ethan stared at the front door, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he had been running from. Now he had to decide whether he could face it. Jack turned off the engine and looked at him. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. Whatever happens in there, just remember that." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his backpack, but before he opened the door, he turned to Jack. "Thanks," he said quietly, "for everything." Jack gave him a nod, his expression gentle but firm. "You don't have to thank me. You're the one making the choice. Just don't give up on yourself, all right?" Ethan stepped out of the truck, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. The air was still damp from the storm, but the rain had stopped. He took a deep breath and walked up to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was quiet when he entered. His father's boots were by the door, his mother's purse on the table. Everything looked the same, but Ethan knew that something had to change. He couldn't live in fear and resentment anymore. He had to face his father, had to try and make things right, even if it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He took a deep breath and walked toward the living room, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say. Whatever happened next, he knew that this was the moment that would define his future. Ethan stood in the dimly lit hallway, his heart hammering in his chest as he stared down the familiar path to the living room. The tension that had filled this house for years seemed to hang in the air like a weight he couldn't quite shake. He could hear the faint murmur of the TV, the sound of his father's chair creaking as he shifted. It was all so normal, so painfully ordinary, yet everything about this moment felt monumental. He hadn't planned what he would say, and now that he was here, the words seemed caught in his throat. What if his father didn't care that he'd come back? What if nothing changed? But then Jack's words echoed in his mind. "You're stronger than you think. Whatever happens in there, just remember that." Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself, and walked into the living room. His father sat in his usual spot, a beer in one hand, the remote in the other. He looked up when Ethan entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to figure out whether this was real. There was a flicker of surprise in his expression, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by the same stoic mask he always wore. "You're back," his father said flatly. It wasn't a question, just a statement, as though Ethan had merely stepped out for a few hours instead of running away in the middle of the night. Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment. "Yeah, I came back because we need to talk." His father grunted, turning the volume down on the TV but not turning it off. "About what?" The indifference in his father's tone stung, but Ethan had expected it. This wasn't going to be easy, and he knew that. But Jack's advice had given him the courage to take the first step, and now he had to see it through. "About everything," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "About how things are between us." His father sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What do you mean? Things are fine." Ethan felt a surge of frustration rise up in him. This was exactly the problem. His father refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong, that there was a reason he had felt the need to leave. But getting angry now wouldn't help. He had to stay calm, had to stay focused on why he had come back. "No, Dad," Ethan said, his voice firmer this time. "Things aren't fine. They haven't been fine for a long time, and that's why I left." His father's face tightened and he set his beer down on the table, finally giving Ethan his full attention. "So, what? You think you can just walk out and then waltz back in here like nothing happened? You think you're the only one dealing with stuff?" Ethan flinched at his father's harsh tone, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "I'm not saying I'm the only one. I know you're dealing with stuff too, but that doesn't mean you can take it out on me." There was a brief, tense silence. His father's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Ethan thought the conversation was about to explode into another shouting match like the countless others they'd had before. But something in his father's expression changed, softening just slightly. "I never asked for things to be like this, Ethan," his father said, his voice quieter now, though still tinged with frustration. "You think I like being angry all the time? You think I don't wish things were different?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the admission. His father had never said anything like that before, had never acknowledged his own feelings in such a direct way. For the first time, Ethan saw a glimpse of the man beneath the anger, the father who was just as trapped in this cycle as he was. "Then why can't we talk about it?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but desperate. "Why do you always push me away?" His father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to fix it. I've been dealing with things my own way for so long that I don't know any other way." The honesty in his father's words struck Ethan harder than he expected. For years he had seen his dad as this immovable force, someone impossible to reach. But now, hearing the vulnerability in his voice, Ethan realized that his father wasn't as invincible as he had always seemed. He was hurting, too, in ways that Ethan hadn't fully understood. "I don't need you to have all the answers," Ethan said quietly. "I just need you to try, to stop shutting me out."